So what are these sensory issues? So we learned about this mostly through one of my kids. And that child, when they were a baby, really liked to be worn in the carrier in front of me. And they didn't like to be out loose in their stroller where they can't see and they felt more exposed. They wanted to be held tight up close in the carrier and they'd sit and swing, or they'd swing for hours on the swing and never want to get out. They struggled with the gym childcare drop off and Sunday school because the noise was too loud and that would cause a lot of problems for them. They didn't like big, noisy, kid friendly places. It was not a good thing for this child. And so, for some other reasons that we're not talking about today, some fine motor delays, we started looking into some occupational therapy to meet those needs. And once they confirmed that we had the fine motor delay, the second term that we were given was sensory processing disorder. And I had never in my life heard this term, had no idea what it meant, but that was 8 years ago, and we've learned so much since then. And that same kid who struggled in all those ways got on an airplane with me last month. And we flew halfway across the country and we spent 5 days exploring a new city, doing lots of big, crazy things. The kid read the metro and learned how to ride escalators and had a blast and didn't have a single meltdown and knew how to meet his own sensory needs. And it was something I never thought would happen. But because we learned about it, sensory issues, because he knew how to empower himself, and because he grew up, though still struggles sometimes, we could still move on and have a full life. But it hasn't always been easy, and I'm really excited to share what it all looks like and some of my favorite tools with you, as well as a new exciting one that I've created just for you. So let's get started. So the first thing, as Molly was telling me a little bit earlier, she was saying she's a seeker and an avoider. So we're going to talk about what that means. So fundamentally, sensory processing disorder, I'm not a doctor, so I'm not going to talk about this too medically. I'm going to talk about this as a mother. So I'm going to just talk about sensory challenges and what this looks like as a parent, from a parent perspective, because I'm not a doctor. So fundamentally, it's how your body processes and takes in the information that all of your senses give your brain so that you can interact well with the world around you. And when your sensory systems are working the way they should, then we'd barely notice them and things just hum along the way they should. And it's not a big deal. But if your system's out of whack or dysregulated, then you feel differently and you take in the information differently, and that can affect your daily life and activities, especially for a kid who's learning about the world for the first time and trying to learn and grow, and they need all that sensory input to do that. So four big things we're going to talk about, and that is, so they can take in information and be less sensitive to the sensory input and the world around them. And so we call this being undersensitive, which means that they need more stimulation to feel the same way that a typical person would feel in order to respond to the stimuli in the same way. So somebody that's undersensitive might crave something that's a bigger deal. And the opposite of that is also true. Sometimes your sensory systems are oversensitive. And so what that looks like is that you need a lot less stimulation to not be overwhelmed and to take things in and find things enjoyable. So those are kind of the opposites. And then the other thing that we have, and we use these a little bit interchangeable, but they're also different, is seekers and avoiders. So a seeker would be someone who actually wants the sensory stimulation so much that they actually seek it out. And this can look disruptive, or maybe even like someone with attention issues, because they're seeking it out. They're going after what they need to feel calm and to feel like their system is regulated. The opposite is also true, that you can have an avoider who really avoids sensory stimulation because they're scared of it, they don't understand it, And they don't want to be overwhelmed because they're overwhelmed easily. They want to avoid too much stimulation because they don't know how to handle it. So that's what it looks like on a really big picture. And now we're going to break down what it looks like, because while we talk about having 5 sensory systems to your body, we actually have 7. And when I was researching this, I actually learned about a bonus 8th system. So I'll touch on that at the end. So the first system we're going to talk about, and this is a really big one when it comes to a place where people are dysregulated, would be the tactile or touch system. So for this, these are the sensory receptors that are in our skin. And our skin has a defensive touch and a discriminative touch. So the defensive touch that we feel in our fingers and in our skin all over our body is whether or not we're in danger. So we take in whether we're too cold, we're too hot, and how we process our external environment. And we're always touching something, even if it doesn't feel like it's a person or a couch, we're still touching our clothes or the ground or the air. So it's always taking in input, even when we try not to be. So the other part of it is discriminative touch, and that is actually feeling how hard something is, how soft it is, and taking in the textures and things around us. So these two touch work together to help us to see and feel the world around us. So it might look like having somebody getting hurt in the backyard, and what one of my children does is that they scream like bloody murder, but actually they just barely bumped their knee. But they had a very oversized reaction because their body is over responsive and doesn't need as much stimulation to feel the same way. So, or it could look like someone who really did get hurt and ripped their pants and has a bloody scrape, but keeps playing because to them it's not a big deal. So you have both ends of the spectrum. Another thing, we're going to be doing a Orbeez water bead activity in the co-op I'm teaching at next week. Well, we have a lot of these left over because my kids didn't want to play with them when they were kids because they didn't want to touch weird stuff. They kind of shied away from those things instead of seeking out that fun and interesting and different textures and feeling things. So that's kind of how it affects the touch system. And this can look like also things like how much your child wants to be hugged or held, or the scratchy tag in their shirt. It can also be why they don't want to brush their teeth, because that's a touch within their mouth. Or walking on their tiptoes because they want to be careful how much they're touching the ground because it feels funny. So there's a lot of different ways that the touch system can look. It also might look like they're just sort of touching everything in sight because it's very tactile and they want to feel things. So we're going to move on to the next one, but there's so much that touch happens, and it's one that we think about all the time because we are touching things and engaging with our touch sensors in our world. So the next one we're going to talk about is our hearing and auditory system. So this is one that most visually you see people who might struggle with this area because they wear headphones when they're out in public, as a way to change and control the amount of sound that they hear. They may or may not be listening to music and shutting out the world, but it also is a way for them to control the environment around them. So if a person struggles to distinguish which sounds to listen to and focus on, then they're spending their energy doing that instead of getting to spend it on other enjoyable tasks. That active listening steals their really good energy, and then it wears them out so they can't do the things they want to do. So it can be a real challenge to kind of know what to do. And a lot of environments that are really helpful for and enjoyable for kids and teenagers often are loud and overstimulating at an auditory level. So it can be a real challenge for helping your kids want to get connected and do the things that other kids typical to their age may be doing. So I see that one of our friends is saying that they have their oldest and it overreacts to getting hurt. It's hard to calm them down. So it's so true. And we have a child that happened to when we were actually out of town visiting family. And it was such a struggle because to our household, this wasn't a big deal. But to the people around us, they were really caught off guard by his oversized reaction to something so simple. And then we can also get a lot of negative comments or negative looks from the people around us, even family members who mean well, because they don't understand and they're not used to the way that our kids react, and we know how to handle it best for them. So trust yourself when that happens and do what you know your child needs. The next one we're going to talk about is our system of sight. So vision issues can be a part of, can be sensory issues. There's also other more challenging vision issues that would require things like glasses or vision therapy. That if your child has trouble tracking when they read, then they're going to have trouble reading. And those are things that vision therapy can help and aren't necessarily a sensory issue. So those are things that are worth looking at with the doctor if the sight issues and visual issues are a problem. If you see me on Instagram or in some of the snapshots that I post on Facebook, more often than not, you will see me wearing a hat. And that's because I really struggle with the amount of light that I take in with my eyes. And we don't usually have a lot of lights on in our house and use the natural light around us and wear hats and stuff to limit it. Fluorescent lights can also cause problems and be really stressful if you're sensitive to the light and visual input, because actually, whether we really see it and notice it or not, the fluorescent lights actually blink and strobe, and so it can be very distracting and hard. Students who struggle with visual perception and or visual processing also can have trouble with contrast and even seeing things in 3D. So different kinds of things. Hand-eye coordination is also a struggle because their visual sense is not working well with their motor sense, which we're going to talk a little more about in a minute. But all of these things work together, and so what we take in with our eyes can also wear us out when it's overstimulating at a way that's different than a lot of our peers. So the next one we're going to talk about, I'm going to talk about them in tandem because when it comes to sensory challenges, they're not really usually very strong or very perceptive. People may have strong reactions to them, but they in and of themselves are not something that a lot of people struggle with at a sensory level, and that's our taste and our smell. So we're going to talk about these together. So at first glance, it seems like picky eaters would struggle with taste. Well, if we actually break down what is involved at a sensory level with the process of eating, it's so much more complex than that. And it's actually not so much what they're tasting, but all the other skills that are needed and the other parts. A lot of it goes back to that touch, that tactile, and that they are touching the food with their mouth and their teeth and their tongue. And so that can be something that has a very strong sensory input. And we're going to talk a little bit more about some of our internal senses that come into play in this in a minute. But things like sitting still can be a challenge, or having the motor skills to actually put the food in the mouth. That was part of what led us to sensory with one of our kids, was having that. So while sharing again my own sensory issues that I've learned about and didn't quite ever understand until we discovered it for my kid, and then learning for my kid helped me learn about me, is while I love to drink apple juice and enjoy the flavor of apple juice and apple cider, as well as baked apples and pie and all those wonderful treats. But if you give me a fresh apple, I can't stand it. And it's not even really, I don't even get a chance to taste the flavor. But the texture of eating a raw apple, I absolutely cannot do it. And I've never been able to. And I just can't do it. And so this isn't a taste issue per se, as I love to taste other things that are apple, but being able to have the texture, which is really a touch or a tactile sensory thing, is actually very much a challenge for me personally. And I hear this from my kids. Different kids have things that they like to eat. And a lot of it comes down to different textures. I have one that really doesn't like rice dishes, and another one that's not such a fan of meat. So it can be a lot more complex than actually just having strong flavor preferences. Kind of alongside that is our smell system. And while students can be under responsive or over responsive, have a bigger than normal reaction when they smell something that may be good or not so good, it doesn't tend to be a primary system that's affected with sensory processing disorder. And depending whether you overreact or underreact to smells can also affect how you react with eating, especially if you're dealing with a picky eater. There's a lot of systems involved with that. So we've gone over the 5 external senses, which is what you and I were raised to talk about and know about. But now we're going to talk about the 3 internal senses, which were completely new to me and made all the sense in the world as far as why my kid was acting the way they were and how it was their life and their senses were so out of balance because they just weren't working the way that most people do and the way that we take for granted as far as how the body works. So we talked, those were external, and now we're going to talk about more internal systems, but obviously we see them in a very external way for those around us. The first one is the proprioceptive sense, and this one focuses on the joints and movements. So usually dysregulation in this sense also is accompanied by the next one I'm going to talk about, which is balance, and also that touch and tactile. So the proprioceptive sense is movement and the pressure and sense of pressure on your joints. So when you walk and jump and bend and hold things, you're giving the actual joints are feeling pressure. So one of the strategies that we learned from an occupational therapy was actually joint compression. So you actually go through in a specific system, an orderly fashion, pushing, compressing, and releasing different joints throughout the body. Kind of like if I would push on this finger, I'm pushing it in and out, which is then putting pressure on those joints to make it feel something. And if you're a seeker and craving sensory input, it can be a great way to put those comments there and to do, to give you or your students some input so that they can calm down and do what you're really asking them to do. So this was a big one for me, and it can really affect the gross and fine motor skills because these are your joints and your movement. So another thing that came into play for my student is that they have low muscle tone. And so they're kind of clumsy already. And then having this kind of thing where they weren't getting the same input to know that they need to sit up straight and do things really affected them. So one of the ways that we do this a lot is to do things like jump. We love jumping on a trampoline. If you've read my biography ever, I talk about that we have 2 trampolines and 5 sets of sizes of pencils. And it's true. We have an indoor trampoline to use when the weather's not so great to be outside or to make it even quick. And we have a large outdoor trampoline that is used 3/4 of the year, often in socks and winter coats. unless there's snow on the trampoline, they'll use it year round, to go out and give themselves a break. We tell them, go jump, and it helps them come back and do their schoolwork and to be a lot calmer. So they can do these weight bearing activities like running and jumping. It also, because of the joints, because of the self-stemming activities that come from wanting this kind of action, it can also include things like kids banging their heads or nail biting or finger sucking if they're a sensory craver, because they want that input, and so they're going to give it to themselves if it's not provided for them around them. It can also look like doing things like chewing on an object, like their shirt collar or cuffs or pencils or gum. I had one child that we actually for a while took their shirt away when they chewed on their shirt, because I was tired of buying more shirts and they didn't even know what they were doing. We were able to replace it, and now we just have to watch his gum habit so that he doesn't eat a whole pack of gum every single day. But for the most part, he's a lot more aware of it now, and so he's able to do more. The next system that we're going to talk about is the vestibular system. And this is the balance and body position that is based around the inner ear that helps us stay balanced and do things. So this one looks like kids that can spin for hours and love it and never get dizzy. This one looks like wanting to slide and spin and swing, because that's the kind of input that they need. They need to do more of those things so that they feel regulated. Doing more is what they need to feel safe. It can also mean that they don't have a good sense of gravity because their inner ear doesn't sense things the same as the typical person. And they may feel threatened if they do a somersault and their head goes upside down. Or they might be scared of heights, even if it's just like walking on a curb. So gravity, how they seek gravity, and then also how they are as far as their balance, which if you're out of balance, doesn't make you a kid that wants to get picked on the playground for sports. And so it can really affect you socially because you're not fitting in and able to do what your classmates expect. So those proprioceptive and vestibular were two brand new senses to me when we learned about sensory processing disorder and learned about having sensory challenges and dysregulation. But then the more I learned, the more it made sense. And they really explained a lot of these strange behaviors and why my kid wouldn't just sit still and be a good kid. So it makes sense to me now to learn all these things. I told you I had an eighth sense for you as well. And that is the third internal sense, which is interoceptive sense. And this one runs on autopilot most of the time, but it regulates our body's function and tells us things like that we're hungry and thirsty or need to go to the bathroom. So for this one, it can really affect people because kids don't sense that they're hungry or they're hungry all the time. So it's one that comes into play a little bit, but again, it's not one of the major ones that shows up as obvious within sensory processing challenges. The three biggest ones are the touch or tactile sense, the proprioceptive, and the vestibular. Those are the ones you're going to see the most of, and then often as you see those being dysregulated, you may see other senses as well that your kids get triggered by. So I want to give you a couple resources to read because, like I said, I am not a medical expert. I'm just a fellow parent sharing all the things that we've learned over the years so that hopefully, if this is new to you, you can know that you are absolutely not alone and have the things that you need to help your child be successful. So first and foremost, I want to share that I have a brand new guide out. It is a blissfully short 30-page book, but it is everything I've shared tonight and so much more. It's got a dictionary of the words that may come up when you first learn about it for yourself. Some more resources, as well as some more details on things. So I'm going to drop the link when we're done here, but it's really an amazing resource. I'm so glad to get it in your hands. I actually had it reviewed by our own OT who taught us everything we know. And I'm forever grateful for her for helping us learn what we need for our kids. But it's a great getting started guide and to put it into your hands and make you a little less overwhelmed as you start a journey with sensory challenges as a family. The next thing I'm going to share are two books that are two of the sort of Bibles on the topic of sensory processing. And there's some of the books that I read when we got started because I didn't have a little quick start guide and had to kind of figure it out from scratch. The first is the Out of Sync Child. And I use this one to refresh my mind, to have the information to share with you tonight. It's easy to reference chapter by chapter in the index, or it's a great read through. Plenty of examples for you to see your own kids and lots of checklists for you to really use to see if it's worth researching more for yourself. And then there's actually a whole series about the Out of Sync Child, including the Out of Sync Child Has Fun, which this is full of activities to do at home or out and about. And it's broken down by which sensory system each activity triggers. So if you know what your kids' triggers and needs are, it's a great one to help find your resources. And then the other one I have for you is Sensational Kids. And this one is written by Lucy Jane Miller. I was trying to, what was it? Yeah. So one of the great resources, this is actually the book, the first one that I read about sensory processing disorder when we were getting started. And it was great with lots of practical tips and tricks and lots of understanding to say, you know what, our kids can be successful in the long run as long as we help them to understand themselves and give them the tools to do what they need to do and to equip them to understand their own needs. So those are the resources I have to help you learn more. I'm going to end tonight with a couple audience questions that were submitted ahead of time. If you have a question you want me to answer, go ahead and leave it in the comments and I'll come back and answer it. Yes, the Out of Sync Child, I actually learned tonight. I knew there was the Out of Sync Child Had Fun and the Out of Sync Child. I learned tonight that there's one about puberty. I know that there's an Out of Sync Child through puberty, the Out of Sync Child when the Out of Sync Child grows up, and then there's another one about adulthood with sensory processing, and I can't remember the adulthood book, but there's actually now 4 Out of Sync Child books. So I'm definitely going to go be picking up the older ones because our sensory challenges are starting to hit the teen years and are showing up in a whole new way. So the first question I have from Laura says, looking for directions on how to redirect or soothe myself when my kiddos are doing their self-soothing activities hits my dysregulation buttons. Like they're clicking a ballpoint pen, which is helping them calm down, but it's highly irritating to me. Tapping on the wood table or loud walking steps, which irritate mom, but are helping the kid to regulate. This is such a tough one because it's true. Our kids are not usually the only ones with sensory issues in the house. Sometimes it's us too, whether we realize it at first or not. And it's true. And one of the things that we do in our family to help with this kind of thing is that we have real conversations. Nothing is a secret in our house when it comes to our out-of-the-box needs for each of us. And so we talk about it. We say, hey, if that's what you need to do, that's great. But I need to work in this room, and that is hitting all of my buttons. So I need you to find a different place to be doing your activity. Or I'll go in the other room too. So we work together to meet our different needs. I had one child that was melting down and screaming, and instead of letting them to distract the whole family and get the whole family off track, we said our rule in our house is, hey, go to your room. It's not a punishment. It's not grounding. It's just go have your meltdown, go scream and do what you need to get it out without distracting the rest of the family. So it's not a negative thing at all, but it lets them do what they need to do without causing a distraction and without bringing the rest of the family down with what they need to do to regulate. So I would encourage, Laura, you to do the same thing. If your kids are old enough to really talk with them and dialogue and say, hey, you need to do this, I need to do that. You know, this is your trigger, this is my trigger. How can we meet those together to do what each of us needs to do and to meet our own needs while also not making each other feel like it's nails on a chalkboard. So, and a lot of it, sometimes our kids are surprised that, you know what, stuff hurts mom and dad too. I was editing my new book this week and showed my teenager because he hates editing. And he often thinks of it as a perfection thing. So I showed him all the red pen that was all over my work, which didn't mean it was bad, but everybody needs an editor. And so it was really interesting to watch him react to the fact that mom wasn't perfect and mom needed to be edited too. That being a grown-up doesn't mean you don't get to edit your paper. And being a grown-up doesn't mean you don't have sensory needs. So being honest about our own needs can sometimes surprise our kids and is a great way to create a way for them to know that we really do get what they need because we're right there with them. The next question I have from a different Laura says, our little love 7-year-old has sensory processing disorder, OCD, and anxiety. With her sensory challenges, she has strong oral aversions, and her diet is very limited, which often leads to constipation. What are some ways we can encourage trying new foods when she is so resistant, and it sets off anxiety if she thinks she has to? We don't force new foods, we just offer them. Okay, so for this question, because I like to share from my own experience and find it valuable, but we're just one family with sensory challenges and with our outside the box needs. So I reached out to my friend Heather from Fearless Faithful Mom because she has so many more, and this is totally her wheelhouse of issues. So she educated me this afternoon when I talked to her about what this is like. One of the first things she said is that you have to separate engaging with food from eating it. So you have to build, so they do things like building with vegetables and toothpicks, kind of like a connect system, or finger painting with condiments, like using a carrot, dip in ketchup, and painting a picture. But before kids will try a new food, especially when they have such a aversion to it and struggle so much with different foods, that just being familiar existing with the food and interacting with it begins to build that positive relationship. And another suggestion was never add a new food at a mealtime, because mealtimes are stressful enough because you have all of the food that needs to be eaten, and you need to eat the food for the nutritional value and for the energy, that adding the stress and anxiety of trying a new food when you need to eat to have the energy to keep playing, living, is too stressful. So you have to separate those things. And I was really surprised because this is a lot like what I talk about with some kids who struggle with different school subjects or have learning disabilities, is that you separate the area in which they struggle from their other subjects, so that when you're working on the struggling subject, you're not also trying to get through the math lesson. So it's okay to act as their writer for their math lesson, because it's not time to practice how to write, it's time to do math. So I found it really interesting that that was part of what Heather said. So she talked about taking a really slow approach to eating. And a lot of the things that she shared is she's actually working with a speech therapists and doing feeding therapy to introduce these new foods to our kids. And I would encourage you to seek out a feeding therapist, which is a specialization for a speech therapist or an occupational therapist, and work with them to find, to help your child to learn new foods. So she was telling me how she wanted me to celebrate with her, which I did with Heather, because her daughter ate a whole barbecue Pringle, but they had to work up to this. They had to smell the food, just smell it, be in the same space, has it, get used to it. And then they would get it to touch their lips. They called it kissing their food. And then they would stick their tongue out and maybe just touch the tip of their tongue to the food. And then they would get a little bit of the texture, followed by mouse nibble bites, taking an itty bitty bite to let their tongue and the inside of their mouth get used to the texture or the flavor. And so they did all these things, but you don't move on to the next layer and the next step until they can do it calmly without anxiety, and it doesn't cause anxiety to smell the food. And so then you move on. And each new food that you can do this with, it will become an easier path. And the process might go a little faster, but it's hard to say. I tried to ask her how long it takes to introduce a new food, and she really couldn't give me an answer because it's so different for every food and every child. So I think it's interesting to hear all these different strategies, and I'm looking forward to having Heather on probably in the new year to talk to us and share more, because their family struggles with both food allergies as well as food aversions and different things. So I think she's got a wealth of knowledge to share with us. But being able to separate that trying new foods and that anxiety away from the dinner table was a really new idea to me. But I think it's a great one. And it's not a lot different than what we do in our schoolwork, where we separate the areas of schoolwork that our kids have struggles so it doesn't hold them back in the other things. So feed them their chicken nuggets and white bread for dinner, and then try the new food at a different time of day so that it's not part of the mealtime is where I would start. And then I would also see if you can find a feeding therapist in your area to work with you to find out which foods to introduce first and how to make that work for your family. As far as dealing with the constipation and stuff, one of the things she suggested was trying to provide food in other ways. For one of her students who dealt with that as well, they would do things of provide the nutrients like prunes in a smoothie where they can hide the taste and the texture with other flavors that they enjoy while still getting the nutrients and the benefits from the foods that they need to eat. So I would love to hear any questions that anybody watching has. And we'll stick around for a few more minutes for questions, but I'm really glad you joined me tonight. And I hope that this was as helpful. It's pretty incredible to think about where my family was 8 years ago when we first learned about sensory processing disorder and where our family is now, from having kids that can sit still and do their work, to having jump breaks and using headphones when they need to, as well as doing things like being able to sit through a church service or go to a theme park, which they couldn't do very easily before. Because if anything is true about our kids, they're always growing and changing, and they're always surprising us. Ooh, great question. Any tips for helping siblings handle other siblings' sensory challenges? So let me know a little bit what challenges they have, and I'll try and speak to those specifically. So we do have different challenges, Molly, at our house. And the biggest thing is that we're just really open with it, that everybody knows that everybody has different triggers and that we talk about it. And so we know not to try and activate other people's. I like to say that being the annoying sibling, I tell my kids, you're being the annoying sibling, and that's not very becoming. So It's not good. In our house, we're kind, and that includes being that we try to accommodate each other's needs, but also find space for it, and that I don't expect someone, the child with sensory challenges, to dominate and control what the family does. They don't get to set the tempo of the room. If what they need is too restrictive, then they're the one that needs to leave and find a different space to be in to meet their needs. I don't expect the rest of the family to match what they need, but we do work together to try and meet each other's needs. I do have one child that likes to be extra loving, and so when the sibling is having a more of a crisis moment or a meltdown, they will go and get a stuffed animal because they know that squeezing their stuffed animal makes their sibling feel better. So we work together to try and meet each other's needs, but also be understanding and accommodating. I think it's always been heartbreaking to me at each age that when each of my kids have asked what's different about myself or my sibling. And so that creates conversations and understanding for each other. So Molly, you say your youngest is a vestibular and tactile seeker. So they want more input and they're looking for ways to be stimulated. And then the next sibling is a vestibular seeker as well, is a tactile avoider. So they want to move, but they don't want people touching them. And also, you don't want to be a tactile avoider sensitive. So you don't want to be touched either. So yeah, that definitely is a challenge. And I think that's where things like the Out of Sync Child Has Fun could be a great book to give you new ideas to help your youngest meet their vestibular needs while also leaving everybody else alone so that they're not looking for other people to bump and crash against or hug and touch, to find other new activities to meet those needs. Another thing, vestibular really likes swings. And so that's something. We have a swing stand for a hammock chair, and we have that hanging in a room. And so anybody who wants can climb in it and get the squeeze from the swing, from the woven hammock swing that will very much hold you instead of having to get it from other people. Yes. Crash hugs. Yes. We definitely have some cuddlers here, and there are times that other people want to cuddle, and there are times that people don't want to cuddle. So I would also just work with a child, with your youngest, which I believe you shared before was more school age. So yes, that they're old enough to learn a little bit of boundaries, that they can be like, yes, I have this need, but I need to ask if I can do a crash hug before I do it. So yeah, I mean, 6 is old enough to begin asking about whether or not, begin to teach some boundaries to your 6-year-old, to be like, you know what, you need to ask before you crash. And then also work on see if you can find things like swings or some of those body sleeves that could hug and help them go upside down. Things like maybe reading a book upside down that wouldn't have to be for vestibular, to be upside down, or find ways they can spin or do different things without having other things. Maybe jumping or crashing on a trampoline instead of onto people, or crashing onto the empty couch instead of into people. But yeah, it's going to be an ongoing conversation. Ooh, that's a great idea. Yes, the giant stuffed animal or beanbag. Absolutely. Yes. Yes, Molly, a giant stuffed animal. In fact, I have seen Amazon has like queen size bed, like 6 feet big bean bags that you can buy. I've got some friends that have them that are pretty good quality. They're not gonna shrink down like the little ones that they can definitely like crash onto, has a crash pad. So, right, it just takes some thinking outside the box for how to meet our kids' different needs. But yeah, having those boundaries and having those brainstorms. See if he has some ideas, or take some time when you're at the playground and think about which parts of the playground does he like the best, and how could you tweak that to make it something at home so that he could use it. Mhm. Ooh, one filled with stuffed animals. We have so many stuffed animals. That would be a great idea. I think I've heard of that, but never tried it. But yeah, filled with their stuffed animals. Yeah, that's a perfect idea. Absolutely right, Molly. You're on the right track. Okay, well, I got through the questions. If anybody else has any, let me know. I'm going to scroll back through and make sure I didn't miss any. And yeah, I will drop the link where you can go pick up the quick guide to sensory challenges again. This is my printed copy while I was editing. So, but yes, it's available online and it's on a special sale through the end of the month. So I'll have more in the newsletter this week about it as well. Thank you all for joining me, and I will see you again next month for our next workshop. As always, any questions you ever have, just drop them in the group and I'll do my best to answer them, as well as I'm sure there's many other parents here alongside you who will also can provide their input into whatever situations you're dealing with your outside the box kids.